So at the heart of 5G is a discussion of small cells. And small cells are the technology which are expected to support the remarkable speeds and bandwidths that we think will be a key characteristic of 5G and will support services like self-driving cars. 5G small cells will need to be deployed very widely in dense urban areas. They also need to be deployed close to the end user in order to support these kinds of services. And one of the key reasons for that is because we expect the high bandwidth, high speed 5G services to ride on what are called millimeter wave spectrum. And radio waves don't travel far in millimeter wave spectrum. The spectrum can handle extraordinary bandwidth and speeds, but the signals themselves don't travel that far. This means in practice that you need to deploy a lot more wireless antenna, and those antenna need to be deployed at street level in close proximity to end users. So from a regulatory perspective, what does this mean? It doesn't change a lot. The core needs of carriers when they deploy their networks remain the same. They need access to roadways and other public places for the deployment of their facilities. They need access to what we call supporting infrastructure. In this case, infrastructure that will support small cells. It could be poles, it could be bus shelters, it could be streetlights, it could be signs, it could be buildings. Third, they're going to need to be able to obtain electricity to each of those small cell sites. And finally, they're going to need to be able to link those sites with a fiber backhaul network, which takes the traffic from each small cell back to the core wireless network. These requirements are not new to 5G or to wireless network deployment. But what changes in the 5G world is that the extent of the deployment, given the large number of small cells, is much greater. So the need to navigate through these issues on an efficient basis, both in terms of cost and time, becomes more critical. It doesn't really change the challenges, but it emphasizes the importance of navigating those challenges, and it emphasizes the costs when there are difficulties in working through those challenges. And carriers have always, when deploying their networks, have had to work through a complex regulatory environment in order to deploy their facilities, because access to what we call passive infrastructure, and by that I mean access to roadways, other public places like parks, and access to supporting infrastructure, is subject to control, responsibility, oversight potentially of multiple bodies, often at different levels of government. And so it's a challenge often to work through those multiple bodies and get timely, cost-effective access to passive infrastructure by carriers. In the case of 5G, as I've said, what happens is the importance of navigating those challenges efficiently becomes even more critical given the extent of the deployment and the fact that there's a lot of deployment occurring in a fairly compressed, potentially, period of time. The core issues are, I would say, first, the approval process for the deployment of 5G antenna. Second, the terms and conditions of access to the roadways and the other public places where the antenna will need to be deployed and maintained. So access by the carriers to do that. Third are the terms and conditions of access to the supporting structures for the small cells, so access to the poles or the street lights or the signs or the buildings to actually place those antenna. And then fourth is kind of an umbrella issue, but that's access to timely and effective dispute resolution procedures in the event of an inability to come to terms on access to any of this passive infrastructure, or come to terms on deployment of a new 5G wireless antenna on a timely and cost-effective basis. So again, not new hurdles, but critical hurdles in the context of 5G deployment, given the extent of deployment that's going to be required. There has been discussion in the last, I would say, year about clarifying that there is a single national communications regulator like the CRTC with authority to order access to passive infrastructure and, as I've just said, address disputes concerning that access by carriers. However, that may require a change in federal legislation. The Fasken Communications Group has core expertise in telecommunications in general, but in wireless deployment in particular, also detailed experience in accessing rights-of-way, highways, public places, and accessing different kinds of supporting infrastructure, including both telephone poles, hydro poles, buildings, and other types of supporting infrastructure.